Good evening and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. Thank you for joining us this Monday. COVID continuing to spread in areas that didn't get hit that hard when the outbreak first started, including Texas.
With what I've seen in the numbers and what my friends have seen, we are New York now. I mean, it's already here.
New York has flattened the curve, but much of the South and the West, it is dealing with huge spikes. We will have full coverage of the pandemic in a few minutes. But first, a story that is so stunning and disturbing, even for this president, hard to believe. Russia reportedly paid the Taliban a bounty to kill U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan. Now, think about what I just said. Horrific enough. But now here's the second part to the story. The Trump administration's response or lack thereof could be even more disturbing. Three of the top news organizations in this country, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Associated Press, are all reporting the story and all with the same conclusions and synopsis. The White House, however, stonewalls and denies. Congressional lawmakers are responding to reports that accuse Russia of offering bounties on U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan.
Further evidence of the fact that Russia is not a friend, they are a foe, despite what Donald Trump may think.
The New York Times first reporting that Russian intelligence officers offered to pay the Taliban to kill American service members amid peace talks to end this nation's longest war. A military official confirming the report to ABC News. And the Washington Post is reporting that intelligence obtained by U.S. military interrogations of captured militants show it's believed that the bounties did result in the deaths of American soldiers. Russia calls the accusations, quote, baseless. The White House today questioning the validity of the claim.
There's no consensus in the intelligence community, and that the dissenting opinions from some in the intelligence community exist.
The commander-in-chief, President Trump, meanwhile says he was never informed of the intel, denying ever being briefed.
And neither the president nor the vice president were briefed on the alleged Russian bounty intelligence.
On Capitol Hill, the backlash was swift.
This is as bad as it gets.
House Speaker Nancy Pelosi criticizing the president's tepid statements, speculating without any evidence the Russians may have damaging information on him.
I don't know what the Russians have on the president politically, personally, financially, or whatever it is.
And presumptive Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden echoing Pelosi's remarks.
It's a betrayal of the most sacred duty we bear as a nation, to protect and equip our troops when we send them into harm's way.
I want to bring in our guest, who is the perfect person to discuss all of this. He's former Democratic governor and senator from Nebraska, Bob Kerrey, also a Navy SEAL who was awarded the highest honor we award our soldiers, the Medal of Honor. Senator, you know, it takes a lot to shock anymore, but when you heard the story about bounties being offered by Russians to the Taliban to kill and apparently succeeding American soldiers, and the non-response by the administration, you know, as bad as I've seen some unpardonable sins in the last 3+ years, I can't think of a worse indictment about an unfitness to lead.
Well, I agree. I mean, first of all, in some ways it's unsurprising. The Russians have been, killing Americans in Syria and engaging us in small-scale conflicts all across the world. But this one's worse because our ambassador, Khalilzad, was negotiating with the Taliban to get a peace agreement. And while that was going on, the Russians were paying the Taliban to kill Americans and coalition forces. And the problem is doubly bad because the president says, I didn't know anything about it. And I don't know which is worse, knowing something about it, not doing anything, and not knowing about it, and saying I'm not responsible. It's hard for me to imagine that the president of the United States or people very close to the president of the United States were not briefed on that. This is a significant piece of intelligence. We now know it was in the presidential daily briefing. We now know that the Security Council did take it up. This is not just a speeding ticket here. This is a significant breach and a significant attack on the United States by Russia, and so it's It's bad enough that the president had known about it and didn't do anything, but for him to say, I didn't know about it, actually makes it even worse. Because to suggest the possibility that intelligence agencies are saying to themselves, we know the president gets upset anytime you talk about Russia, so we can't talk about Russia. Except it now appears highly likely it was in the presidential daily briefing and nothing was done about it.
You know, you were on the Intelligence Committee. I can only imagine. Put yourself back on that committee. This apparently was passed around. This wasn't last week. You're just learning of it now. And by the way, as senators are being briefed in real time as we speak, apparently the White House still hasn't been briefed because a quote-unquote consensus hasn't been reached on this. I just don't understand how this wouldn't be the top priority. And even take away morality here. From political transactional purposes, what president wouldn't get in front, walk out in Rose Garden and say, any SOB who took out American soldiers and paid the Taliban to do it is an enemy of an American. I will avenge those Americans. I mean, again, take the morality out. I mean, it's sitting on a tee for a president to look like an avenger of American soldiers.
Well, yeah, and it's doubly bad because rather than, and there's a number of actions that the United States could have taken against Russia about having got this intelligence back in March, and actually the operators had uncovered a significant amount of cash in a Taliban site, I think all the way back in January. So they were picking up pretty strong evidence that something was going on, and it wasn't just the Taliban acting independently or acting with the support of the Pakistanis. This was the Taliban operating with the full support of Russia against us. And rather than responding to it, as I said, there's a number of things that could have been done. What does the president do? He invites Russia to the G7. He wants to elevate their stature in the world community. It has to baffle our allies, especially those that still have troops on the ground in Afghanistan. I mean, it's a I don't know how far you want to go with it, but I'm pleased actually that Republicans in the Congress are starting, after hearing about this, starting to say we need more information. We got to get facts here. We got to know what happened. Because early on, I thought, oh my God, this is going to be another one where they're afraid to criticize the president. I promise you, if this is Barack Obama, they'd be talking impeachment. This is a significant mistake that the United States leadership has made. I see people calling it treason. I wouldn't call it treason, but the commander in chief is supposed to be in charge of protecting American GIs that are in harm's way. And clearly in this particular case, he didn't.
And as I mentioned before, you received for your service the highest commendation our country gives. I just imagine those families, Senator, they lost a loved one in Afghanistan, and now they've got to wonder, was it my kid who was killed by Russians paying bribes here to the Taliban? And where's my government for my kid now? What about the memory of my son or daughter?
No, I think it's likely that you're gonna have such a family who says, my son was killed in Afghanistan as a consequence of the Russians giving money to the Taliban. I think that's likely to happen. And it's going to be one more blow to American prestige and Americans' confidence that this system of ours works. I mean, again, it's one of the most important things for the president to do, and maybe the most important thing to do, is to protect our troops in the field. And you can't just give a speech. You can't just have a photo op. You actually have to act if they're imperiled. In this case, they were imperiled by Russians giving money to the Taliban. Now, I may be overstating exactly what we have in the way of intelligence, but we have solid intelligence. And I hope that from the news, it looks like both the House and the Senate are going to get to the bottom of it, both Republicans and Democrats, because this isn't going to be any good if this becomes one more partisan issue where the Republicans just say we have to defend our president. You cannot. If it becomes clear that the president either knew or should have known in March that the Russians were paying Taliban to kill Americans, and you didn't do anything about it, whether you knew or didn't know, it's bad. And so the underlying intelligence of Republicans and Democrats have to get to, which is it true? Did the Russians know? Did the Russians pay the Taliban? And did we know about it? And if we did know about it, why didn't we do anything? I'm encouraged that Republicans are moving on this, because this cannot be another one of those situations where I say there's 1.5 million people at my inauguration, turns out there's less. This can't be just another misstatement. This can't be another lie that the Republicans say, well, he's our guy, we got to stay with him. It can't be. It's way too important. And I'm pleased, Lindsey Graham has been talking about it. A number of other people have been talking about it. They've got to ramp this thing up. They cannot. Joe Dunford once said something extremely important, which is if you walk by something, he was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, you walk by something at a substandard and you don't do anything about it, it becomes a new standard. This cannot be the new standard for America's commander-in-chiefs.
It is always good talking to you, and I appreciate a few minutes today. Thank you. Up next, everyone, we're going to discuss the Taliban story, including what is next and the politics involved.